Are you really gonna buy this piece of junk?
The girl's voice came through the rain softly, calmly, like she wasn't asking a question so much as confirming something she already knew. Ethan Cole stopped walking. The salvage yard stretched across the western edge of Cedar Hollow, like a graveyard for machines people had stopped believing in. Rainwater dripped from twisted bumpers and cracked windshields. Rusted pickup trucks leaned into collapsed sedans. Somewhere in the distance, metal chains rattled against a flatbed in the wind, and near the back fence, beneath a flickering yellow light, sat the Chevrolet. The girl stood beside it with her hands tucked into the pockets of a dark red coat. She looked young, maybe 25, pale skin, long black hair damp from the rain. There was something strange about the stillness in her face. Not cold exactly, just distant, like she had spent a long time watching people leave. Ethan looked at her for a moment before answering. Maybe. The girl smiled slightly, not amused, not mocking, more like disappointed in advance. Most people in Cedar Hollow avoided the salvage yard entirely. The place smelled like wet metal, old oil, and forgotten years. But Ethan had come looking for a replacement heater fan for his truck, because winter was coming early this year, and the heating system in his 2006 Ford pickup had already started making the kind of noises that usually ended in expensive repairs. He was 39 years old and carried exhaustion, the way some men carried old injuries quietly and permanently. Ethan was tall in the way working men sometimes are. Broad shoulders worn down slightly by years of physical labor, dark blonde hair that needed cutting, a beard that had stopped being intentional months ago. His face still carried traces of the man he had probably been before grief settled into him and decided to stay. He worked as an electrical maintenance contractor around the coast, small jobs mostly. Broken panels, failed wiring, storm damage, the kind of work people only noticed when something stopped functioning. Which, lately, felt familiar. 2 years earlier, his wife Sarah had died after a sudden heart condition nobody saw coming. 34 years old. A second-grade teacher with tired green eyes, curly brown hair she never had time to style properly, and the kind of warmth that made strangers tell her personal things in grocery store lines. Sarah had been the center of every room she entered, and when she died, the rooms stayed standing, but nothing inside them felt arranged correctly anymore. Especially Ethan. Since then, life had narrowed into routines. Wake up, make breakfast, drive Lily to school, work until dark, pay bills, pretend everything was manageable, repeat. The only thing in his life that still felt unfinished was his daughter. Lily Cole was 8 years old, with long brown hair, usually tied in uneven ponytails. She made herself because Ethan had never learned properly. She had Sarah's eyes and Ethan's silence. Thin, observant, the sort of child who noticed emotions. Adults thought they were hiding well. Since her mother died, she had stopped talking as much. Teachers described her as well-behaved, which Ethan had learned was often another way of saying sad. The girl in the red coat stepped slightly aside. The Chevrolet came fully into view. A 1957 Bel Air, ash gray, beneath layers of dirt and corrosion. The chrome was faded almost black. The windshield carried a long fracture down the center. One tire had sunk halfway into mud near the fence line. The car looked abandoned, even among abandoned things, but Ethan crouched beside it anyway. Because something about the frame bothered him, or interested him. The body was ruined. That part was obvious, but underneath the rust, the chassis still looked straight. No warping, no major collapse. Whoever owned the car before had taken care of it once. Serious care. "You see it too," the girl said quietly. Ethan glanced back at her. "See what?" "That it's not dead yet." Rain tapped softly against the hood. For a second, Ethan was unexpectedly reminded of his father. Richard Cole had been a mechanic in the old sense of the word. Backyard garage, oil-stained jeans, country radio playing through broken speakers. A man who trusted engines more than people, and usually had good reasons for both. Ethan grew up handing him wrenches on Saturday mornings, while old Mustangs and Chevrolets sat half disassembled in their driveway. His father used to say, "Machines are honest. People quit long before machines do." Richard died 12 years earlier from lung cancer, and after that, Ethan slowly stopped fixing things that didn't absolutely need fixing. Dreams became utilities. Passions became expenses. The salvage yard owner approached through the rain, carrying a clipboard under one arm. His name was Frank Delaney, mid-60s, heavy-set, thick white mustache stained yellow from decades of cigarettes. Frank spoke with the flat tone of a man who had spent too many years around people trying to negotiate over dead things. "That Chevy came in 8 months ago," he said. "Nobody's touched it since." "How much?" "700. Ethan almost laughed. $700 was reckless right now. His checking account held barely more than that. Lily needed winter boots. The house heater still made clicking sounds every night. And his truck might not survive another season. Every rational part of him understood this was stupid, but he kept looking at the car. The girl in red watched him carefully. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes people throw away things because they don't know what they're looking at." Frank snorted. "Or because it's garbage." But Ethan barely heard either of them anymore, because for the first time in years, something inside him had become curious. And curiosity, he realized suddenly, felt dangerously close to hope. 20 minutes later, he signed the paperwork. Frank handed him the keys with visible confusion. "You serious about hauling this thing home?" "I guess I am." The girl smiled again. This time there was sadness in it. Real sadness. Then she reached out and touched the edge of the hood gently with her fingertips, almost affectionately. "You should listen carefully when it starts," she said. Ethan frowned. "When what starts?" But the girl had already turned away into the rain. By the time Ethan looked up again, she was gone. Not far away. Gone. Completely. Frank glanced around when Ethan mentioned her. "What girl?" "The one standing right there." Frank stared at him for a second. "Buddy, it's been just me and you out here." The flatbed delivered the Chevrolet to Ethan's house shortly after sunset. His home sat near the eastern cliffs overlooking the Pacific, a small, weathered wooden house with peeling paint and a sagging porch that Sarah had once insisted they would fix someday. Someday had become one of those words Ethan hated quietly. The garage behind the house had not been used properly in years. Dust coated the shelves. Old tools sat untouched beneath tarps. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood and rust. Lily came outside, wrapped in an oversized yellow sweater. She stopped when she saw the Chevrolet. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she walked slowly around the car, studying it carefully. "It looks lonely," she said. Ethan leaned against the garage doorway. "That's one word for it." She touched the side panel gently. "You're gonna fix it?" "I don't know yet." But Lily smiled anyway. A real smile. Small, brief, but real enough that Ethan noticed immediately, because it had been months since he'd seen one. That night, after Lily fell asleep upstairs, Ethan stayed alone in the garage, staring at the Chevrolet beneath the hanging work light. Outside, rain drifted softly across Cedar Hollow. Somewhere farther down the road, an old dog barked once, and then fell silent. Across the street sat the abandoned house that had been empty for nearly 15 years. At around 11:40 p.m., Ethan heard piano music coming from inside it. Soft, slow, beautiful. He straightened immediately. The music lasted maybe 20 seconds before stopping completely. Ethan walked outside into the cold night air and stared across the road. The house remained dark, empty. No lights, no movement, nothing. He stood there for a long moment. Then he looked back toward the garage. The Chevrolet sat motionless beneath the light. But for just a second, Ethan could have sworn the radio inside the car gave off the faintest flicker of static. And somehow, impossibly, the dashboard clock was glowing. 12, 7, even though the battery had been dead for years. The dashboard clock was dark again the next morning. Ethan stood alone in the garage, staring at it, while cold ocean wind slipped through the cracks in the wooden walls. For a moment, he honestly questioned whether exhaustion had finally started affecting him in ways he couldn't explain. The radio was dead. The battery was gone. The entire electrical system looked decades beyond repair, and yet sometime after midnight, the clock had glowed. 12-7. He knew what he saw. Outside, Cedar Hollow woke slowly beneath another gray coastal morning. Fishing boats groaned out near the docks. Rainwater dripped from pine trees along the cliffs. The town always looked slightly unfinished in winter, like something people meant to come back and repair but never did. Ethan pulled an old tarp off the garage workbench and began organizing tools. At first, the plan was simple. Strip the Chevrolet down, salvage what still had value, sell it for more than $700 and pretend this entire thing had been a practical decision. Quote, but 30 minutes into removing the front panels, that plan started falling apart, because nothing about the car made sense. Underneath layers of rust and flood damage, the Bel Air carried signs of expensive custom work, not amateur modifications, professional ones. The weld lines beneath the hood were clean and deliberate. The suspension had been reinforced by someone who understood performance engineering at a level Ethan rarely saw outside restoration magazines. Even the engine mounts had been customized. He crouched lower beneath the frame, wiping away dirt with a rag. Someone had loved this car seriously once. Not casually, not nostalgically. Seriously. Lily appeared in the garage doorway, still wearing her school backpack. She watched him quietly for a moment before stepping inside. Did you sleep here? Ethan smirked faintly. Almost. She set her backpack down beside the workbench and wandered toward the Chevrolet. Today she wore a faded blue sweater, nearly swallowing her small frame. Her hair was uneven again, one side braided correctly, the other half falling apart. Ethan noticed immediately. Who did your hair? I tried. Lily ran her fingers carefully across the dusty side panel. I had a dream about this car. Ethan kept working. Good dream or weird dream? Both. That answer felt strangely reasonable. While Ethan removed the damaged dashboard panels, Lily sat cross-legged nearby, drawing in her sketchbook. Since Sarah's death, drawing had become the place Lily disappeared into whenever emotions became too large to explain aloud. Today, she kept sketching the Chevrolet from different angles. Every drawing made the car look sadder somehow. By noon, Ethan discovered the first strange detail. Beneath the steering column, partially hidden under corroded wiring, someone had carved a tiny symbol into the metal frame. A crescent moon crossed through by 3 thin lines. Not factory work, intentional. Old, he stared at it for several seconds before photographing it with his phone. You find treasure? Lily asked. Maybe. She nodded thoughtfully, like that made perfect sense. Later that afternoon, Walter Brennan wandered across the street, carrying a paper cup of coffee and wearing the same dark wool coat he seemed to own in every season. Walter was 72 years old, with silver hair combed neatly back and a face deeply lined by years of salt air and regret. He lived alone in the weathered blue house beside Ethan's place and spent most evenings sitting on his porch smoking cigarettes beside an old trumpet case he almost never opened anymore. People in Cedar Hollow described Walter as polite but distant, the kind of man who answered questions carefully because he had learned long ago that words had consequences. He stepped into the garage, slowly, then stopped moving altogether when he saw the Chevrolet clearly. For the first time since Ethan met him, Walter looked genuinely unsettled. Where'd you get this? Salvage yard. Walter approached the car carefully, almost reverently. His fingers brushed the chrome trim near the driver's side door. "Hell," he muttered softly. Ethan noticed the reaction immediately. "Claw, you know this car?" Walter hesitated too long. "No," he said finally. "No. Just knew someone who owned one similar." It was a lie. Not an obvious lie, but practiced lies always carried a certain tiredness to them, and Ethan recognized that tone because he used it himself sometimes around Lily. Walter changed the subject quickly and helped Ethan remove part of the front grille assembly. Despite his age, his hands still moved with surprising precision around tools. "You used to work on cars?" Ethan asked. "A long time ago." "You were good at it." Walter gave a small smile. "Not good enough." That evening, after Lily finished homework upstairs, Ethan continued dismantling parts of the Chevrolet, alone beneath the hanging garage light. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The ocean wind carried distant foghorns through town. Around 10 p.m., while removing the rear interior paneling, Ethan found the cassette tape. It had been wrapped carefully inside oilcloth behind a loose metal compartment. Written across the faded label in black ink were 2 words, "For Evelyn." Ethan stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked toward the dashboard radio. The thing shouldn't even have power. Still, after several seconds of hesitation, he slid the cassette inside. Nothing happened at first. Just static. Then suddenly, jazz. Warm trumpet music flooded the garage for maybe 5 seconds. Rich, beautiful. Alive in a way that made the entire room feel different. And then it vanished. Silence returned instantly. The radio died again. Ethan slowly looked around the empty garage. Outside, rain continued falling over Cedar Hollow. But for the first time in years, the house no longer felt entirely empty, and that frightened him more than he expected. The trumpet music stayed in Ethan's head long after the radio fell silent. The next morning, he replayed the moment over and over while driving Lily to school through the wet coastal roads of Cedar Hollow. Gray fog rolled low over the cliffs, swallowing half the ocean. Lily sat quietly beside him, holding her sketchbook against her chest. "You're thinking about the car again," she said without looking up. Ethan glanced at her briefly. "Is it that obvious? You look less tired when you think about it." That answer stayed with him longer than he expected. After dropping her off, Ethan skipped 2 smaller repair jobs and spent the morning inside the town library instead. Cedar Hollow Public Library occupied an old brick building near the harbor that smelled faintly of salt air and old paper. The librarian, Martha Green, was a thin woman in her early 60s, with silver glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, and the permanently patient expression of someone who had spent decades whispering for a living. Martha knew almost everyone in town and remembered details people forgot about themselves. When Ethan mentioned the name written inside the cassette case, Miles Arden, her expression changed immediately. "You're talking about the trumpet player." Ethan looked up. So he was real. "Oh, very real." Martha lowered her voice instinctively, though the library was nearly empty. "Played all over Portland in the late 80s. Jazz clubs, mostly. People used to drive hours just to hear him." She disappeared briefly into the archive room and returned carrying a dusty newspaper binder. Inside were faded articles, showing a younger Miles Arden standing beneath stage lights with a trumpet in his hands. Ethan stared at the photograph. Miles was handsome in a worn-out kind of way. Tall, dark-haired, sharp cheekbones, the face of someone who probably slept too little and thought too much. Even frozen in old black and white print, there was loneliness in him. "He vanished," Martha said quietly. "One day people were writing reviews about him. Then, suddenly, nothing." "No death certificate?" She shook her head. "No obituary either. He just disappeared." That afternoon, Ethan returned home carrying photocopies of old articles and an uncomfortable feeling that the Chevrolet had somehow chosen him instead of the other way around. Inside the garage, he began removing more of the dashboard assembly. Rusted screws snapped loose one by one beneath his hands, while rain drifted steadily outside. Then he found the compartment. Hidden behind the glove box was a narrow metal panel Ethan hadn't noticed before. Someone had welded it carefully into the frame decades earlier. Inside sat several folded photographs, handwritten sheets of music, and a small brass bank key attached to a faded tag reading, First Harbor Trust. Ethan spread everything across the workbench, beneath the hanging light. One photograph showed Miles Arden leaning against the Chevrolet beside a woman Ethan assumed was Evelyn. She had soft blonde hair pinned loosely back, and kind eyes that reminded him painfully of Sarah. Not because they looked alike, but because both women carried the same warmth, the kind that made other people feel calmer just standing near them. In every photo, Miles looked at Evelyn, like she was the reason the world still made sense. Ethan understood that look immediately, and hated how much he understood it. Upstairs, piano notes stumbled softly through the house. Lily had started playing Sarah's old upright piano again, 3 nights earlier, after nearly 2 years of refusing to touch it. The instrument sat near the living room window, covered in tiny scratches and water rings from coffee mugs Sarah used to leave there while grading school papers late at night. The music Lily played wasn't good yet, but it filled the house, and that alone changed something. Later that evening, Noah Harper came over after school carrying a stack of comic books under one arm. Noah was small for his age, pale, with messy black curls constantly falling into his eyes. He spoke quickly when nervous and slowly when sad, which meant he usually spoke slowly. Other kids ignored him because he preferred drawing monsters and spaceships in notebooks instead of playing sports. Lily liked him immediately for exactly that reason. While the 2 kids sat at the kitchen table drawing, Ethan noticed Noah sketching something repeatedly. A woman in a long red coat, standing beside the ocean cliffs. Ethan stared at the page. "Who's that?" Noah shrugged. "I don't know." "You've seen her before?" "No." The boy frowned slightly. "But I keep dreaming about her." The room went very quiet after that. Near sunset, Walter appeared again, carrying an old trumpet case beneath one arm. He lingered at the garage entrance before finally stepping inside. "You found out who owned it," he said. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded slowly. "Miles Arden." Walter closed his eyes briefly. For a second, he looked older than Ethan had ever seen him. "We used to play together," he admitted quietly. "Small jazz club in Portland, called Blue Lantern." Ethan leaned against the workbench. What happened to him? Walter looked away immediately toward the rain outside. That's the part nobody really knows. It was another lie, or maybe only half of one. But before Ethan could push further, Walter opened the trumpet case and removed the instrument carefully. The brass was old and dull with age, but his hands handled it gently, almost lovingly. Then, without another word, he played. The melody was low and aching and familiar. Ethan realized halfway through it was the same tune that had played from the Chevrolet radio, and somewhere deep inside him, something cold shifted slightly. Because for the first time, the story surrounding the car no longer felt strange. It felt unfinished. That night, Ethan dreamed of a fog-covered coastal road, stretching endlessly beside black ocean water. Somewhere far ahead, hidden beyond the mist, a trumpet echoed softly through the dark. And standing near the edge of the road in her red coat, the girl waited silently beside the Chevrolet. By the time October reached Cedar Hollow, the entire town smelled like rain-soaked wood, cinnamon cider, and cold ocean air. The Fall Lantern Festival arrived the same weekend the storms briefly stopped. Every year, the town gathered near the harbor with strings of yellow lights hanging above the streets, while local musicians played beside food stands, and children ran between bonfires, carrying paper lanterns. Sarah used to love the festival. Ethan realized that the moment he parked the truck near Main Street, for 2 years, he had avoided almost every public event in town. Too many memories. Too many people, asking careful questions in careful voices. But Lily had insisted on going this year, and somehow he had said yes before thinking hard enough to refuse. She walked beside him now, wearing a cream-colored coat and knitted gloves slightly too large for her hands. There was more life in her lately. Small things, more questions, more smiles. Sometimes Ethan caught her humming softly without realizing it. Grief, he was beginning to understand, did not disappear all at once. It loosened slowly, like winter ice cracking apart beneath water. The festival crowded the harbor streets with warm light and music. Teenagers danced beside portable speakers while older couples drank coffee near fire barrels. Somewhere farther down the pier, a saxophone player stumbled through old jazz standards badly, but enthusiastically. Then, Ethan saw her. The girl in the red coat stood near the center of the crowd beneath, hanging lanterns swaying in the wind, exactly the same as before. Dark hair, pale face, calm eyes that never seemed surprised by anything. People moved around her constantly, but somehow nobody touched her. Lily stopped walking immediately. "That's her," she whispered. Ethan felt cold despite the firelight. The girl looked directly at him. Then she smiled faintly and stepped backward into the moving crowd. Ethan followed instinctively. Past food stands, past dancers, past laughing strangers carrying paper cups of cider. For several seconds he lost sight of her completely. Then he found her standing alone near the edge of the docks, where fog drifted low over the black water. "You know something about that car," Ethan said. The girl tilted her head slightly. "Everybody knows something about something." "That's not an answer." "No." She looked out toward the ocean. "But it's the truth." Up close, Ethan noticed details he hadn't before. Her coat looked old-fashioned somehow, not vintage in a fashionable way. Older than that. The fabric worn softly at the sleeves like it had belonged to her for years. "You knew Miles Arden." The girl's expression changed almost invisibly. Not surprise, pain. "Some things," she said quietly, "shouldn't stay buried forever." Before Ethan could speak again, fireworks erupted over the harbor behind them, lighting the water gold and red, and when he looked back, she was gone. Again. That night, after Lily fell asleep exhausted from the festival, Ethan drove with Walter to First Harbor Trust Bank on the northern side of town. The bank itself looked nearly abandoned, a narrow brick building surviving mostly because old fishing families still trusted paper records more than computers. Walter had barely spoken during the drive. His face looked hollow tonight, as though memory itself exhausted him. The night manager, Harold Bennett, met them at the entrance. Harold was a short man in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and permanently nervous eyes magnified behind thick glasses. He recognized Walter immediately. "Haven't seen you in years," Harold muttered. Walter forced a smile. "Wish this was a social visit." The safety deposit vault smelled faintly of dust and old metal. Harold retrieved the box connected to the brass key Ethan found inside the Chevrolet and left them alone without asking questions. Walter stared at the box for several seconds before speaking. Miles used to say music was the only thing people left behind, honestly. Ethan opened the lid carefully. Inside sat several reel-to-reel tape recordings wrapped in protective cloth, handwritten jazz compositions, and one sealed envelope, labeled simply, "Tech." For Evelyn. Ethan unfolded the letter slowly. The handwriting was sharp and elegant. "If you're reading this, then somehow the car survived longer than I did." Walter turned away immediately after hearing that line. Ethan continued silently. The letter spoke about unfinished songs, about regret, about Evelyn becoming sick long before anyone realized how serious it was, about Miles being unable to keep playing music after losing her because every note started sounding like grief. Halfway through the letter, Ethan stopped reading, because suddenly he wasn't hearing Miles anymore. He was remembering Sarah, the hospital room, the silence afterward, the impossible feeling of returning home while someone's entire existence had simply stopped. Walter sat heavily in the corner chair, rubbing one hand across his face. "I should have called him back," he whispered. Ethan looked over slowly. "What happened between you two?" Walter stared at the floor. "Life," he answered quietly. "That's usually what happens." When they returned home near midnight, another unfamiliar car sat parked across from Ethan's house. Dark blue Lincoln sedan. Expensive. A man leaned casually beside it, smoking a cigarette. Tall. Thin. Mid-40s. Hair slicked neatly back, despite the wind. The kind of face that smiled professionally instead of sincerely. He introduced himself as Daniel Mercer. "I heard you recently acquired a certain Chevrolet Bel Air." Ethan instantly disliked him. Mercer glanced toward the garage with visible interest. "There are collectors willing to pay very serious money for that vehicle." "I'm not selling," Mercer smiled calmly. People usually say that before hearing the number. After he drove away, Ethan stood alone outside the garage for a long time, listening to ocean wind move through the trees. Inside the house, Lily's piano practice drifted softly downstairs, while Walter sat silently beside the Chevrolet drinking coffee that had already gone cold. And for reasons Ethan couldn't fully explain yet, the house no longer felt haunted by absence. It felt like something was slowly returning. The storm reached Cedar Hollow just after midnight. By 2 in the morning, the entire coastline had disappeared behind walls of rain and black ocean wind. Power lines groaned overhead like strained metal cables ready to snap. Waves crashed hard enough against the cliffs to shake windows across town. Then the electricity went out. The house fell into darkness, instantly. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and pulled on his coat before hurrying outside toward the garage. Rain hit so hard it almost hurt. Water already rushed down the driveway in shallow rivers, carrying leaves and broken branches toward the street. Inside the garage, the Chevrolet sat beneath the hanging work light, now powered only by a weak backup battery. Water leaked steadily through the old roof. Buckets overflowed near the shelves where Ethan had stacked Miles Arden's recordings and handwritten music. "Dad!" Lily appeared in the doorway wrapped in Sarah's old, oversized raincoat. Behind her stood Claire Monroe, carrying 2 plastic storage bins against her chest. Ethan blinked in surprise. Claire pushed wet blonde hair away from her face and gave a small, breathless smile. "You left your front door unlocked." Claire Monroe was 29 years old with soft features and calm blue eyes that rarely seemed hurried. She taught music at Lily's elementary school and moved through the world with the careful patience of someone used to helping nervous children believe in themselves. She dressed simply, spoke gently, and laughed quietly like she didn't want to interrupt the room around her. Since Sarah's death, Ethan had unconsciously avoided warm people. Claire made that difficult. "We brought containers," Lily said quickly, "for the tapes." Thunder cracked somewhere above the harbor. Together they began moving the recordings and sheet music onto higher shelves, while rain hammered the garage roof louder and louder. Walter arrived 20 minutes later, soaked completely through, carrying an old canvas tarp over one shoulder. For a 72-year-old man, he still moved stubbornly fast when something mattered. "We need to raise the back end," he shouted over the storm. "Water's coming under the floor." Ethan slid beneath the Chevrolet with a jack, while Walter helped stabilize the frame. Water soaked through Ethan's jacket immediately. The garage smelled like rainwater, motor oil, and cold metal. Then suddenly, the engine turned over. All 4 of them froze. The Chevrolet coughed once, twice, and then the engine roared to life. Deep, rough, alive. The sound filled the garage so suddenly it almost felt human. Lily stared wide-eyed. Claire covered her mouth instinctively. Walter looked like someone seeing a ghost walk through the door. The headlights flickered weakly through sheets of rain, while the engine idled unevenly after decades of silence. Ethan slowly stood from beneath the hood, breathing hard. "No battery," he whispered. Walter looked terrified now. Not amazed. Terrified. While checking the flooding beneath the rear seats, Ethan noticed loose fabric separating under the soaked upholstery. He cut carefully through the damaged lining and found another hidden compartment sealed inside waxed leather. Inside was a folded manuscript. The pages were stained at the corners but mostly intact. At the top, written in elegant black ink, were the words, "Ashes of Summer." Walter took the pages with trembling hands. As his eyes moved across the unfinished notes, his face collapsed completely. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. "I heard him writing this," Walter whispered. "The last night I saw him." The storm outside intensified. Rainwater slammed against the garage doors while thunder rolled endlessly over the coastline. Walter sat heavily beside the Chevrolet, staring at the music. "He gave me the car after Evelyn died," he admitted quietly. "Said he couldn't hear music anymore without hearing her voice underneath it." Walter swallowed hard. "He told me to keep it safe until he figured out who he was supposed to become next." Ethan listened silently. "But he never came back?" Claire asked softly. Walter shook his head. "No." For a while, only rain filled the garage. Then Noah burst through the side door holding an old handheld camcorder beneath his jacket. His curls were soaked flat against his forehead, and his glasses fogged from the cold. "You have to see this thing running," he said breathlessly. The boy immediately started filming the Chevrolet while lightning flashed outside behind the garage windows. And through the open doorway, far beyond the flooded street, Ethan saw her again. The girl in the red coat stood beneath a flickering street lamp at the end of the road, perfectly still, watching. Wind tore through her dark hair, while distant trumpet music drifted faintly through the storm. Then, the streetlight blinked once, and she was gone. The storm left Cedar Hollow washed clean and strangely quiet. For 3 straight days afterward, fog drifted low across the harbor, while workers repaired fallen power lines and broken docks along the shoreline. The town moved more slowly after storms. People spoke softer. Coffee shops stayed fuller. Everyone carried the same exhausted gratitude that came from surviving another Pacific winter. But the Chevrolet changed everything. Word spread faster than Ethan expected. First came local curiosity, then collectors, then people from outside Oregon entirely. By the following week, unfamiliar cars appeared regularly outside Ethan's house. Men in expensive coats walked slowly around the garage pretending to admire craftsmanship, while casually mentioning numbers large enough to erase most of Ethan's financial problems overnight. 25,000, 40,000. One man from Seattle offered 70. Another offered more without even seeing the engine run. Daniel Mercer returned twice, always smiling, always patient. "Cars like this become legends," he told Ethan calmly one afternoon while standing beside the garage. "Legends are expensive." But Ethan noticed something strange every time someone discussed money around the Chevrolet. The car suddenly felt smaller. Sadness had lived inside that garage for years before the Chevrolet arrived. Quiet grief, routine loneliness, the slow fading of a man who stopped imagining a future larger than surviving next month. The car had changed that, not because it was valuable, because it made Ethan care about something again. One evening, while replacing damaged wood panels inside the garage, Ethan realized he had been humming softly without noticing. That alone almost made him laugh. Claire noticed the change too. She started coming by more often after school, with Lily carrying sheet music and grocery bags and small pieces of warmth the house had been missing for years. Sometimes, she stayed for dinner. Sometimes, she helped Lily practice piano while Ethan worked in the garage nearby, listening quietly through the open door. Claire had a way of making ordinary moments feel safe. She moved carefully through grief without trying to fix it. Ethan trusted her for that. Walter began bringing his trumpet again. At first, he only polished it silently while sitting near the Chevrolet beneath the hanging garage light. Then one evening, without warning, he started playing. The notes came rough initially, rusty from years of silence. But by the second song, something returned to him. Lily stopped playing piano upstairs, just to listen. Even Ethan stood motionless near the workbench. Because the garage no longer sounded empty, it sounded alive. 2 months later, the old building beside the house reopened under a hand-painted wooden sign, reading, Evelyn Garage and Cafe, half workshop, half tiny jazz cafe. The front room smelled like coffee, cedarwood, and old vinyl records. Local fishermen stopped by in the mornings. Travelers occasionally wandered in from the highway. On weekends, Walter played trumpet near the windows, while Claire helped Lily rehearse Ashes of Summer on piano. During opening night, the entire room fell silent while Lily played. Her hands still stumbled over difficult notes sometimes, but the melody carried something honest inside it. Walter cried openly halfway through. So did Ethan, though more quietly. Winter arrived early that year. On the first cold morning of December, Ethan woke before sunrise and walked outside, carrying a cup of coffee toward the garage. The door stood slightly open. At first, he thought the storm wind had forced it loose overnight. Then he noticed the silence. The Chevrolet was gone. No broken lock, no tire tracks, no shattered glass, nothing. The space where the car had sat for months looked strangely untouched except for one thing, resting carefully on the driver's stool nearby. A red scarf, still slightly warm. Ethan stared at it for a long time. Then faint music drifted softly through the garage. Jazz. Low trumpet notes, crackling gently from the old radio, sitting alone on the workbench. Lily appeared beside him wearing thick winter socks and Sarah's oversized sweater hanging nearly to her knees. She looked toward the fog-covered coastal road stretching beyond the cliffs. "I think the car went home," she whispered. Ethan said nothing. Together they stood quietly, watching pale morning light spread across the ocean, while fog moved slowly through the pines. And far out along the coastal highway, barely visible through the mist, an ash-gray Chevrolet passed silently between the trees before disappearing completely, as though it had never belonged to this world for very long in the first place. Sometimes the things we think are broken beyond repair are the very things that bring us back to life. Ethan believed he was buying an old, forgotten car, but what he really found was a reason to feel something again. A reason to open the garage door each morning. A reason to sit with his daughter a little longer. A reason to stop surviving and start living. And maybe life works that way for many of us. Sometimes healing does not arrive loudly. It comes quietly. Through small routines. Through unfinished dreams. Through old memories. Through people who stay beside us when we think we have already been forgotten. The Chevrolet was never just a car. It was proof that even after loss, even after loneliness, even after years of silence, a heart can still start again. Maybe there is something in your own life you have given up on too early. A dream, a relationship, a talent, or maybe even yourself. Do not bury it yet. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this story touched your heart in any way, share where you are watching from in the comments. Tell us what part of Ethan's journey stayed with you the most. And if you still believe that broken things can heal, type Amen in the comments so someone else reading it tonight knows they are not alone. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories about hope, second chances, and the quiet ways life changes people. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and remind you that even in your hardest seasons, you are never truly forgotten.